Well, thanks, Lindsay. And well, for me, it was an honour to be invited, so I'm very grateful to be here. And I'm not an architect that's yet found his voice. What I'm going to be talking about is this topic, landscape of resistance. Landscape is something that we construct. It's not something that pre-exists. And so how do we construct landscape? Resist what? Resist the destruction of the biota natural systems. That's really what my work is about. So I call myself an architect. I also call myself a landscape vivisector, understanding that we're operating, it's not just me, but all of us as architects, we're actually operating on living natural systems. And to kind of take a step back and understand that when we're building in places like this, what an incredible privilege and responsibility that is. And in a sense, what I'm going to be presenting to you is a 20-year project. I started in February 2000, and it's kind of been like an initiation process for me to understand a particular landscape on the south coast of Western Australia. Now, Lindsay talked about bushfire, and I haven't talked about it yet. But what we're finding in Australia is because of the fear that we have for bushfire, we're blaming the bush. I spend a lot of my time, particularly the last 10 years since Black Saturday, advocating for the protection and conservation of bushland and for architects to consider bushfire as a catalyst for creativity. And I work a lot with journalists to get this message out there, international journalists, particularly in the last few weeks. All you've got to do is build a house that doesn't burn down. It's actually pretty simple. So this is where I'm from. I like to call it the southeast coast or the east coast of Western Australia. So it's where the very southern part of Western Australia starts to come up into the Great Australian Bight. And for those that might be familiar with some place names, the cross there is halfway between Albany and Esperance. This area is part of the southwestern floristic province. This refers to the southwest of the continent. This is the most important biophysical area of this country. There are a greater number of plants endemic to this area than anywhere else in Australia, and it's second only to the Cape Province in South Africa. So if you want floristic diversity, you go here. You don't go to rainforests, you go here. The light grey area in this region, so we're getting closer and closer to where I'm from, is farmlands, and the dark grey is this floristic diversity. And again, if some of you are familiar with some of these areas, this in the bottom left is the Fitzgerald River National Park. This little area right beside me is the Stirling Range National Park, directly north of Albany. Amazing landscape. What we've got here is north of this dotted line is the oldest part of the Earth's crust, the first bit of the Earth's crust to solidify. That's called the Yilgarn Craton. And then from that, so that's a plateau. We've got salt lakes. You can see them there on the image. This is a satellite image that I created from Landsat data, so it's not a Google image. And then on the downside of this, we've got river systems that are running down, and they actually run right through to the continental shelf. So we've got a kind of two completely different landscapes. And so the dark grey areas look like this. This is a photograph taken from a crop duster plane. I'll talk a little bit about the pilot later on. And we're flying at about 300 metres above sea level. So the mountain here is only about 400 metres. That's West Mount Barron. There's this incredible low-lying scrub. So this is what it looks like on the ground. Now a little bit about the cultural landscape. We've talked about the biophysical briefly. This black line represents the last and largest War Service land settlement scheme in Australia. So War Service land settlement scheme, this was populated by predominantly soldiers from the Second World War and Korean War and their families. And this clearing started in the mid-1950s. and is still going on today. This area represents around 500,000 acres, so about 200,000 hectares. So we've got about 100 kilometres across and 150 k's north to south. My father was in the Second World War. I was adopted at birth, and a few weeks later, I went to this house. That's in the light grey area. There's 133 of those houses. They're still there. They're all exactly the same. There's 133 shearers' quarters that are all exactly the same. There's 133 shearing sheds that are all the same. The sheep yards are all the same. We had the same tractors. We had the same harvesters 133 times over. We broadacre cleared that land in one of the most important floristic regions of the planet. That's my house that I grew up in. And we called it Content. It's my mum and dad, my late father. My mum's 94 now, she's still alive. This is how we cleared it. We burnt it. Flattened it with bulldozers, waited a few weeks, got all the neighbours around, ignited the whole perimeter of, say, a 200-acre area, and we created these mushroom cloud human-made bushfires. And this was the excitement of growing up in this region. At the primary school, you'd look out every week and you'd see one of these mushroom clouds from the land clearing. So this is an area that hadn't really experienced any form of sedentary habitation until the late 1950s, and this is how we lived there. We just stripped it clean. Now, we had fantastic crops for the first few years, and then we had massive droughts and sand blows and so on. In the mid-90s, this little peninsula right beside, so the farm I grew up in is just up here in the very top right of the image. On the bottom, on this peninsula that I've highlighted, was subdivided for housing in the 1990s. And these are the houses that are built there. These are my neighbours' houses. Some of these are by architects. So this is all in this extraordinary heathland, which is called Kwongan, which is a Noongar word. So this is Aboriginal peoples from the south of Perth right down in the Great Southern. Kwongan means actually the moonlight on the sand, reflecting off the sand. So light reflecting off sand. Now, we don't see much sand in this image, but right through that southwest floristic province, it's sand. It's actually, paradoxically, incredibly infertile. So how can you have so much speciation with such infertility? The reason is the age of the landscape. The fact that it's just been undisturbed by glaciation and major events for so long that we've had the time, the duration there to facilitate speciation. So we've got in this image, which is one of my study sites, about 250 species in that photo. And so what we have is a landscape that just gets destroyed. People are terrified of fire, they're terrified of snakes, they think this stuff is shit, and they still do. And for me, growing up on that farm, I thought, hang on a minute, I've got a big project here. This is way beyond building a beautiful house. This is, how do we actually construct this landscape of resistance? How do we construct meaning, value on this that only botanists are appreciating? How do we do that? So I started in 2000, and at that time I thought I'd make it a 10-year project, and obviously it's bigger than 10 years and bigger than one person. So I looked at a particular area, one of my first projects, and I consulted a database, which is called Florabase in Western Australia, and I found within that square area, now this is actually a panel which, if you imagine 3 A0 pages, and the text is about 9 point, there's 3,500 species of indigenous plants in that area, 3,500. And a bit hard to see at the back, but 20% of those 3A0 panels is blank, and that's what botanists, their hunch is that they're still yet to discover in that area. And this is just a wonderful quote from a local botanist. if you tried, you could discover a new species every day when some scientists are delighted to find one in a lifetime. That's these landscapes. How can you even imagine that you could know it and design a house for it when we're still got this hunch of even trying to work out what's there? The same area, there's 26 species that are farmed for agricultural production, that exact same area. So I started to really look at different ways of representing that landscape, and I was reading some interesting text. So this is actually, I think, really quite relevant for us. For the earth is heavy, but to fly is not to remain above this heaviness or gravity, as though we were to live in houses on stilts. It is to know how to lighten the earth itself, as though we were to insert oneself into it like a surfer in a wave. So how do we insert ourselves into the landscape? So this was using photographic techniques. So the Pinnacles landscape, which is a landscape which is a sort of calcified and sedimented by perpetual calendar photographs, scenographic images, Instagram images of this calcified landscape. So how do we actually lighten that? So this is actually using durational photography, long exposures with stereo cameras, and then revealing a different reality of that landscape, revealing it as light rather than solid geometry, geology. Another artwork was actually projecting light immediately into the landscape and recording those projections. Were it not for light's straightness, our vision would be muffled, smeared and stunted. This is a fact of sight, the miracle of which is in all its expansive plenitude depends on the unswerving uniformity of light's propagation. Light is, after all, the ultimate geometric instrument. So what I've done here is in a sand dune in the middle of the night, I've projected a laser leveler and done that over a period of about 3 or 4 hours, and had the camera recording, just a still camera on a tripod, film camera, and I've recorded those contours immediately within the site. So rather than getting a contour map and understanding the site, I've actually projected that as light into the landscape and recorded that event. And in the process of doing this, I realised I was enacting a form of cartography. I was actually an actor in the space generating the cartography, and I thought this is really something that we're not exploring enough as creative practitioners, is the role that we could play in representing and mapping these landscapes. So in the process of this, I actually bought 10 acres of this amazing Kwongman vegetation as a study site on this peninsula, amongst all this subdivision. And I trained myself how to be a surveyor, and I used the highly precise global positioning systems that's very sort of millimetre precision. I worked with a local botanist to survey all the biodiversity, the plant diversity that is within that study site. And I generated a series of these maps which are about plant communities. So groupings of plants, and then understanding how this landscape was burnt in 2002, a couple of years after I started studying it, understanding actually the mobility of the plants. The propagation through wind, prevailing winds here, and so on. So these are all different selections of plant communities. So a lot of time on site with a GPS, mapping all of the kind of ecotones, the areas of these plants. A lot of time walking around the exposed geology on these peninsulas. Just time on site, just immersed, trying to read this landscape. As I said, kind of an initiation process before I could even think about designing homes. Understanding that, or discovering for me that this is metamorphosed granite, this is gneiss or gneiss, and this has got this very strong linear trend in it, and it actually forms this orientation right through the landscape, makes all these islands and peninsulas. It's also the same direction, curiously, as the prevailing winds. We can see the dune blowouts. So we start to get a linking of the geological form, the soil types and the plant types in a very interesting kind of pattern. So again, studying the work of other botanists and trying to realise and represent the kind of mobility of this landscape. And then getting a bit more high-tech, again, working with a terrestrial laser scanner. The first time such technology had been used in a vegetated landscape. So this at the time, in the year 2001, was a $500,000 instrument that had never been used in vegetation before. And thanks to Curtin University's kind of belief in what I was doing, we managed to map it. So what I was fascinated about terrestrial laser scanning is the texture of the representations you get from this. It's like LiDAR, except it's on a tripod. And every pixel is actually a three-dimensional geometric point. And so I was fascinated with the correspondence between that form of representation and the heath itself, which was so fine-grained. This image is just taken standing there, at the horizon. It's the same kind of texture you'd get if you're flying above a rainforest. These plants are so small. Another reason why the speciation and the infertility of the soil, lots of very small individual plants fitting into a small area. So the kind of the visual and aesthetic correspondence between the scanner and the heath fascinated me. This is kind of the technology behind it. You get that, it generates millions and millions of points, you can generate contours, you get all this stuff, but you've got to make sense of it. That's abstract. So the thing about using this surveying gear is that it's all georeferenced, so you can go back repeatedly over time, and you can lay things upon previous forms of mapping, all within the exact same coordinates. So every dot here is actually a three-dimensional point in AutoCAD or whatever CAD you might be using. You can take photographs and position them within that three-dimensional cloud. This one is, I guess, a bit more literally kind of the vivisector approach. This is a plan view of a section of the site where I did a lot of scanning and then sliced it up on the axis of the geology and of the wind. So we're looking at an area here, this is about 500 metres across, I say 200 metres high. So we're just looking at these strips here, running with the wind and geological formation. When we see them side on, we get these kind of CAT scans through the landscape. These are about 1 metre thick scans. There's millions of points of measurement within here. If you're a person, which is about this high in here. These are trees, this is the heath. This is what it looks like more close up. So a person is about twice the height of the yellow line there. So you can see from this that the heath is impenetrable. It's a surface. It presents itself as a surface. We don't really, what does it mean, as an architect? You're not designing on the ground, you've got this surface which is hovering above the ground. So that's kind of fascinating because the laser can't penetrate beyond what the human eye can see. What was fascinating was, as I mentioned, in 2002 there was a bushfire. We went back, we set the scanner up on exactly the same points and we scanned it again. And now when we put those two together, we get the double skin of that landscape. We've got the ground skin and we've got the heath skin. So that's this kind of sectioning through the site. And you can do, you can model this, not just in a formal model, but you can model the performance of the landscape, the double skin, with the wind, with the geology, and then you can play with that. And I've got a project more realised than this that I'll show a little later on. So all this within this landscape, which is so incredibly subtle that you just can see it as a surface. You see the horizon, you get fascinated and kind of distracted by the ocean view, but there's actually so much going in here. So how do you reveal that through architecture, through spatial intervention? So we've got a landscape that really should be viewed like this. Too often we look at a landscape as that we're seeing out there, and we don't see that as this. We know that those rocks, in a split second's time, are going to be in a different position. They'll come to rest eventually, but this, when we look at landscape, when we look at our picturing of landscape, when we, as an architect, take a contour map that's been generated by a surveyor, anything that we get, we need to understand that it's actually more like that. That's what we're looking at. It's dynamic. So how do you actually design for that? So this is this site. Then the fire, and then again, constantly changing. This photo is now about 10 years old. So the duration of landscape. So another art project was exploring that. Going back to my landscape, one of these abandoned houses, 133 of them. A lady died there not so long before I went and did this project. I turned it into a camera. So just a straightforward camera, blocked out the windows and did these durational photographs, 5-minute long exposures inside this camera. Then I turned that camera into a collapsible box, and the innovation here was to not have a floor in the camera and to build the camera immediately over and within and on top of landscapes from which I'm from. The crop duster pilot died in a plane crash, and his sons inherited his farm. Good family friend of mine, and so here's the camera built over the barley crop the first season that the two brothers were working on the farm without their father. No Photoshop, no mirrors, no lenses, just a building built immediately over the barley crop with a little hole in the wall, and me inside for 5 minutes with this guy creating that image. Another site. $133 of those shearing sheds in that landscape, all exactly the same. Korean War veteran, about to appear in the next image. They'd just sold their farm, and he was one of the original ones from 1955. There he is there. His son, and then his grandson is a little blur there upside down, and then the flock of sheep that they'd just sold. So the duration of landscape, understanding that these guys have got story, there's gravitas here. These people, you know, this is a big part of their life, they're having to sell the farm. But also understanding that all these people actually appreciate the aesthetic dimensions of their farms and their life as well. So how do we collapse that into one image? How do we get, really vivid picture, mental picturing, eidetic imagery, eidetic understandings of landscape, and our aesthetic understandings into one? So on my own site, the camera with my botanist friend, so that's on my study site. So interestingly for me, this is how I got my first commission as an architect, not from a portfolio of work, but from doing these artworks. And it led to this project, which is just a few hundred metres from my study site. And this is really the project that led me to be a kind of an advocate for, bushfire as a catalyst for creativity for architects. Because this project was realised just before Black Saturday, and the media decided to get interested in it. So a lot of time on site setting it out and so on, as a lot of us do. And I won't go into the technical aspects of this, but it's a relatively low-cost structure. It's facing due east. It's a really windy place. So let's strip all the verandas and so on off these structures, and moderate the light and the glare and the insects and of course the bushfire with these perforated screens. So this is in the Kwongan. This project was about protecting the Kwongan and doing that by building a resilient building. So there's a correspondence. There was a nice correspondence between this kind of perforated landscape, this kind of texture, and a lot of the time that the occupants are spending in the house looking through those perforations. So Black Saturday, just a little brief kind of interlude into Black Saturday. So, I worked for 3 survivors of Black Saturday. This is down in Murrindindi, and I learnt pretty quickly that what we presented in the media, or what we tend to passively consume by way of the media, is not really the true story. That we're looking at a structural fire here that was obviously triggered by a bushfire. But the reality here is that no bush itself actually caused the problem. It was the embers. 90% of houses are lost actually from sparks. So we need to both deal with the combustibility of the elements immediately outside of our house, so whether that's the decks, fences and so on, and we need to deal with the apertures that get beyond our non-combustible exteriors that can get into the interiors and so on. So I learned pretty quickly that houses actually burn the bush. If you actually start to interrogate some of these images, these are my own photos, the elms and oak trees in this image were actually burnt by the house, not around the other way. So I've spent the last 3 years on the Australian standard. Some of you are probably familiar with AS 3959. The new one is 2018. And this is the most important part of the new standard, and this is my contribution as an advocate for you guys. So this image actually says, this diagram on page 17 says that trees are not the problem. And I want to reinforce this with you, and I need you to be my advocates too, is if in any of your projects that you're working on that are in a bell zone, bushfire prone area, don't let anybody tell you you need to remove the trees. We need the trees to create the microclimate around the houses, to reduce the fire danger index around the houses, to keep the moisture in the soil, to trap the embers, to ameliorate the high-speed winds. We need the trees. There's no evidence in Australia of a house being lost from a canopy fire from a tree. None. Okay? None. So this diagram actually says you measure your bell levels to the fuel, not to the trees. Now, fuel is anything less than kind of 6 millimetres diameter. Imagine your little finger. For like the first 2 or 3 metres, above ground level. That's what the fuel is that's in the fire front. It's not the trees. We need the trees and we need the canopy. In fact, we need to restore the canopy in Australia to get our fire danger indexes down. So the text at the top is really important. This is new in the standard, and the Western Australian Department of Planning saw that this was the most significant change in the standard. What this means is you can't do a bell assessment from an aerial photograph. You're not doing bell assessments anymore to the drip line of a tree. This is actually a huge change. So what is architecture about? I think most of you know that it's about connecting people with place. It's a bridge. This is a professional firefighter and his wife, who's the head of an emergency department as a nurse. And my wife Kylie and I designed this house for them, the Carey Firehouse. So it's non-combustible. It backs into the landscape. It's got multiple lines of defence to protect against embers and radiant heat. And it's in one of the coldest areas of Australia, which most bushfire-prone areas are, like the Blue Mountains, for example. And so we actually need thermal mass in those areas, and which of course is fireproof. And this is the front side, the northern elevation of the house. So the light is moderated by the forest. This is Eucalyptus diversicolor, which is carry trees. Privacy is from the forest, all integrated. So it's really about balance, that house. It's about balancing some landscape and fuel management with bushfire safety. But my view is we need to get more radical than that. We need to take Noel Pearson's provocation of the radical centre. If we really want to generate a new typology of architecture, which is what I think we need to do in Australia to deal with bushfire, we need to think the way that Noel Pearson has encouraged us to think, the idea of the radical centre. Let's not think that we can balance nicely, a bit of bush clearing and a bit more of a resilient house. Let's actually really get right in the middle of the problem and really think differently. It's a bit easier said than done. This is my landscape. This is how it performs. And this is a project that I had to try every trick in the book as an advocate, as an architect, as an artist, as a landscape vivisector to get approved. And what I have approval here is for a Class 10B structure, which is something that it's not very often explored by architects, for an artwork, for a permanent artwork on my site. And because it's Class 10B, the bushfire regulations do not apply. It's a Class 10B, which is the same classification used for signs and kind of lookouts or platforms. And I used it for an artwork, which just happens to be the size of a house. This really is about aesthetics, and I'm not talking about that thing. I'm talking about this thing. And when I got approval, I made it really clear, because I had to go to a council meeting, and I had to game the council meeting. I got more of my friends in there. I outnumbered the councillors. As I said, every trick in the book. I was desperate times. I said to them, the artwork is this and this. One cannot be separated from the other. That's what the artwork is. So there won't be any clearing. There will not be any clearing. In fact, this thing is going to be burnt. This thing will be burnt by a bushfire. And then it will be even better than how it will be when it's new. It's designed to be burnt. So it's about aesthetics. What I mean by that is that this is what our fellow architects do. They rock up, they don't do anything, they just go, fantastic view, what is the best view? And then they capture that. This is my site, this is why I bought this site. It's got a great view, but it's also got the extraordinary Kwongan. So every aperture has an equal size, proportion, area, and so it's about that communicating that this is as significant as the ocean view. And the underlying, I guess, philosophy here is that this stuff is way too abstract for us to understand. It's way too abstract. I spent 10 years generating artworks, exhibiting them around Western Australia, overseas and so on. It's really abstract stuff. So what is the role of architecture? What can architecture do to help us appreciate this stuff, which is on the very edge of our perceptual kind of capabilities? As I said, it's intended to be a bridge or an armature. So literally, that is the footprint of the building. So a very kind of surgical approach to getting in there and lowering this building effectively into it. That's led us to another project, which is my neighbour's, a similar kind of approach, but now a Class 1A structure. So really using an external exoskeleton that can be burnt and then making all the kind of sensual kind of interior within that. This picks up on those geological lines that I mentioned earlier on with the wind pattern and so on, kind of built into the structure of the building. And then a little structure on the same site that Kylie and I own called Camera Botanica, and it's one of these. I bought one of these 133 buildings and I've bestowed personhood on it. What I mean by that is that these things are horrible, right? Nobody really wanted to be in these. They had these like 3 pathetically small windows. It's all clad inside and out with asbestos. So I stripped it all off. You can see the landscape in the background. This is my landscape. There's nothing kind of left, a few eucalypts. Stripped it all off. This thing is only 4.2 metres by 3.6, so 12 by 14 foot. And my brothers who are builders could make that in an afternoon out of treated pine. Right, like that. So what is going on here? So this is a 60-year-old structure that's been sitting there kind of unloved. And so this is what I mean by personhood. This is like taking this thing and going, okay, this is the experience you had. That whole landscape, 3,500 species, wiped out. Now let's reposition you, put you in this new landscape. And let's open you up. Let's not think about bushfire shutters and all that kind of palaver and get caught up with all the regulations. Let's actually just open all the walls up. Let's not think about the walls, these openings having windows behind them. Let's just have the whole wall system and then deal with that afterwards. So this is all clad with a fireproof fabric over top of the hardwood frame. So we've got like the most seasoned eucalyptus marginata frame here, Jarrah. It's been sitting there for 60 years. So that's a seriously seasoned hardwood wrapped in fireproof fabric. And then there's a 40 mil offset, and then there's sort of almost 2 mil thick sheet steel. Now it is still under construction, and this is fairly close to complete on the inside. So you can see how transparent it is to the landscape. So it used to just have these windows. So I have to fight tooth and nail to preserve all this vegetation. And what's interesting is since I bought this property, this Kwongan is now protected by the Federal Department of the Environment. And if any of you here are practicing in Western Australia, you will learn that in most states, particularly Tasmania and Queensland, it doesn't matter what level of protection vegetation has, the bushfire regulations override everything. But this Kwongan is protected by federal law. So there is now pushback. They can't force me to clear that stuff. So it's a dynamic kind of space. But this is really what's happening all around the country is so here they issue a bushfire notice, and if you don't clear the bush and the trees, you get fined, they'll come and do it and charge you for the cost of removal. That's the reality that's happening in Australia. That's what's happening on my sites and for my neighbours. So that's why I need your help to push back on this. This is from Ian Byrne. Landscape is not something you look at, it's something you look through. So this is, this is really, because we're not talking about the form of the architecture here, we're talking about this relationship. The intention here, as I said, it's under construction, is to inscribe this text on the louvers so that when occupants are in there, that is kind of reminded. Now, coming to the last project, we're now in southern Tasmania, in, curiously, a really similar landscape to the one that I'm working on over here. So what point that I wanted to make about here is that I have no genealogical story that goes back in time working in that site. In 1961, that house was built and that land was cleared. And then, as I said, I was adopted at birth in 1963, and then suddenly I'm there, the first generation of people that are actually living there in a sedentary way. That's a pretty significant thing. And it's really, my view is that, we as architects can often be outside of this system. I know, Jim, you're inside the system, and so what I mean by that, and Paul, coming from a farming background, dealing with that sort of paradox of being involved in mass sort of land clearing, and now looking at how we can actually work, really kind of reverse that kind of role, yeah. So it's there's so much opportunity for architects to work kind of outside of their disciplinary boundaries. When we start thinking about the fact that landscape is not a given, that landscape is something that we construct. So I guess what I'm trying to encourage each of you to do, firstly, is question every form of representation you're given about the site. Whether that's a contour map from surveyors or a Google image, question that. Understand what process went into generating that. Understanding, for example, like a Google image has no clouds in it, right? Because they select all the clouds out. Whereas the images that we were working with back as architecture students in the 90s, you get satellite images and then you'd see lots of clouds. So there's straight away like a difference. Being a trained surveyor now, or self-trained surveyor, I can read a contour map from a surveyor and see the errors pretty much straight away, and be able to commission a surveyor to either redo the work or get the meaningful information that's important to the project. So really question that information. So having said all that, I'm going to show a Google image. So this is actually this site on the Tasman Peninsula, and it's looking across at Bruny Island. It's a pretty extraordinary area, and for those of you that know that area, it's not far from the tessellated pavement. So we're only 10 k's from Port Arthur here. And really curiously and really quite, I guess, what was surprising for me was that the geology, the rock formations, this gneissic kind of trending was really similar to southern Western Australia. And we get, all this kind of almost mentally confounding kind of geometry. You think you've worked it out and then you realise, hang on, there's this other trend happening here and these other fissures here, and then there's a gneissic kind of thing going on. I mean, a quartzite thing. It's really kind of a bit hard to get your head around. And we start to doing these kind of images to try and unpack it. And I reduced this kind of thinking down to just a really simple geometry, which is, this is an incredibly windy site. We've just got, I was there the other day, and 40-knot winds coming straight in off the ocean. And the house is only 100 metres or so from the ocean. Just hitting this facade. And it's really, it's kind of overwhelming. You can't, building the thing was quite a challenge. So a very simple kind of geometry, and then that's just kind of a broken rock. And what that does is gives us a lot of kind of alignments. North is straight up, so we've got an east-west, and we've got these axes straight to the view, and we kind of open this thing up. And we end up with these two pavilions. So this is this kind of wind-buffered elevation. The house is under construction. We see a bit of the geometry here, again, while it's under construction. This is actually a Bell 29 house. It's not a super high-level protection. There's a few things that tricks that I pulled to game the standard to get it through. But the siting, the house couldn't really have been sited, even though they own 3.5 hectares, on a different site. To put this structure anywhere else would have destroyed the site because of the Tasmanian requirements for the asset protection zones. In Tasmania, Western Australia and Queensland, you basically cannot build a house any more resilient than BAL 29. So I hope I'm not being too abstract here with my terminology. BAL 29 is only the halfway up the level of resilience that the Australian standard actually allows for. What that means is that you have to create a cleared zone around your house to facilitate a BAL 29 level of exposure to the outside elevations of the building. That means you've got no choice but to bloody clear around the house. This is, really frustrating. So, obviously I do what I can to push back on that. I'll work with state government planners and so on to try and get some flexibility. So, but fortunately we can just mow this with a mower, keep the benches in place on this elevation so this doesn't blow away, and then it's positioned right up against these eucalyptus amygdalina trees, which are really quite old. The dune has actually been pushed up against the trees. They're like half submerged. And we create a leeward kind of wind-protected kind of courtyard in between these trees, which hopefully will prosper a bit more now that they're out of the wind. So thank you, Paul, for this photograph. So this is actually the approach to the house. You can see that relationship between the house and the eucalyptus amygdalina. And then, once you're in the house, you're looking straight out across to Bruny Island, which you can't actually see. It's obscured here. That's Bruny Island there in the background, salmon things and so on. So it's a fairly brutal house. It's going to be a little bit challenging living there, but it's going in the fact that you've just got a facade of glass and the climate is controlled on the inside. Most of my houses are all got solar systems. They're either off-grid or grid-connected renewable energy systems. They of course harvest their own water and do all that stuff. Very, very large openings, 36mm thick insulated glazed, double glazing to deal with the wind. So a big space between the outside sheet of glass and the inside because of the wind buffeting. And this kind of nice kind of happenstance moment, so this kind of fortuitous moment with the text. And this is the windward side of the building. As I said, it's under construction. Thank you. So.